Mr. Speaker, let me first say thank you for the preemptive promotion to Honorable Minister. I hope that someday in the future that minister will be the highest office and will not be the Prime Minister but the President. I also hope that while I stand here, should I run over time, that one of my colleagues in this House will stand and extend to me a 5-minute courtesy, or maybe even 10, if I am not concluded. Mr. Speaker, I rise today on request of you and my colleagues in this Honorable House a little latitude, not out of disrespect for this House, nor its honorable members, but out of respect for the taxpayers who placed us here. All of us. I wish to first thank my wife and soulmate, Amanda Shuman, our loving children, my parents, my siblings, and extended family, the hard-working team of the Liberty and Justice Party, my colleagues in the joiner, and my ancestors. Because of your collective love and support, we will do our part to support and critique all agendas connected to our country's development. Mr. Speaker, I also congratulate you and all members in this House on your election. I wish everyone a happy Indigenous Heritage Month. As a father and empathetic Guyanese, I would like to express my heartfelt condolences to the Henry family and the Singh family and others who lost their lives during the recent string of violence in Berbice. I also echo the collective call for justice for these murdered youths, because justice delayed is most definitely justice denied. Mr. Speaker, His Holiness the Dalai Lama said, "Politics and religion are pure institutions. It is people that corrupt them." While this is not an indictment of my honorable colleagues in this House, it is a somber warning of the effects that we in this House have on our society, both locally and in the diaspora. We tend to ignore, whether conveniently or unintentionally, how the misuse of our speech can have a corrosive and corruptive effect on the minds of the very people who elected every member to this honorable House. Mr. Speaker, the concept of corruption should not only be viewed through a monetary lens, but also through the words we choose to use in the service to the people. I recall in 2016, when sitting in the gallery of this esteemed House, the former Minister Keith Scott, during debates, stated that Indigenous peoples are avaricious, greedy. This incident, amongst many others, Mr. Speaker, mesmerizes me and continues to provide sober reminders of the gruesome legacy of settler colonialism and how it has impacted the consciousness of our esteemed House and, by extension, all Guyanese society. Mr. Speaker, for the first time in our history of parliamentary democracies, an Indigenous person was duly nominated as the Deputy Speaker of this national parliament, of a national parliament. A groundbreaking moment in the history of Indigenous peoples in this country. A position that bears no political clout, but holds incredible symbolic political capital to Indigenous peoples in Guyana, CARICOM, and the world. It was unfortunate, yet not surprising, Mr. Speaker, that this momentous shift in Indigenous representation within this honorable House could not enjoy collaborative, bipartisan support. Instead, Mr. Speaker, Commentary involving my election to the position specifically referred to me as an it and also an abomination. One would assume the honourable member was describing the harrowing events of March 3rd and its subsequent effects of bringing Guyana to the precipice of democratic collapse. Mr. Speaker, I marvel at the flurry of linguistic markers issued in that statement by the honourable member. Markers that were steeped in classism and reeked of coloniality. I suppose the very symbol of an Indigenous person in authority creates substantial psychological discomfort to those who were socialized to view Indigenous peoples as being subservient and in need of paternalistic supervision. It is the same repressive and exclusionary approach that my colleagues on this side of the House are invoking to deny my presence on any parliamentary committee. Not a single committee. Maybe that an Indigenous leader can fight to protect democracy preemptively created psychological discomfort. Some may believe that colonialism is a thing of the past, but its ideology appears to be manifesting through the actions of several of our honourable members in this House. Mr. Speaker, on the first day of these budgetary debates, an honourable member spoke of institutions where comebackies and remigrants occupied office. Yet it was a comebacky that brought down the APNUFC government and triggered the events of March 2nd. It is a comebacky who is speaking to you right now, who also fought for the preservation of democracy and helped to fend off a dictatorship in Guyana for 5 long months. And it is those very comebackies that every political party courts for their support during the elections season. Mr. Speaker, we need to move past these harsh dichotomies that borders closely to the realm of xenophobia and recognize that we are all Guyanese. Mr. Speaker, I sat quietly as the lone opposition member in Parliament at the presentation of Budget 2020 while my colleagues absented themselves. We were elected to do the people's business, and while sometimes we disagree, we have an obligation and must act with the utmost responsibility and civility. Mr. Speaker, I would like to remind my colleagues that while a drop in a pool causes a fading ripple, actions and words uttered in this House stand to create tsunamis that can cause tremendous destruction to our people and our nation. Mr. Speaker, I wish to bring to this House's and the nation's attention the severe policy deficiencies in relation to Indigenous peoples that continue to exist within previous and current budgetary debates. My colleagues spoke of Indigenous lands, Mr. Speaker. Let me offer a short history lesson. In 1814, when Guyana was given to the Brits by the Dutch, one conditionality upon that giving was to respect Indigenous peoples' territories. Fast forward to 1966, when Guyana gained independence. The only conditionality for independence was to ensure Indigenous peoples received our rightful titles to our lands. Yet here we stand, 206 years later, and government after successive government continues to use Indigenous lands for votes. During the first 28 years of independence, Indigenous lands were given at roughly 2.28 titles per year. The following 23 years, it was 1.67. And in the last 5 years, it was -1. -1, Mr. Speaker. Such a shame to the legacy of the late Honorable Stephen Campbell. Whether it is the PNC or PPP in office, regardless of who sits in that big house, Mr. Speaker, the government at the end of the day is still the government. It is a superstructure that needs urgent recalibration in order to offer meaningful support to Indigenous peoples and all Guyanese. Mr. Speaker, the Constitution of Guyana, in its preamble, says, "Value the special place in our nation of the Indigenous peoples and recognize their right as citizens to land and security and to their promulgation of policies for their communities." The state has shown that they value the Indigenous people so much that some of our brothers and sisters have been locked in a court battle for over 23 long years for their lands, without even getting past the very first court. Government after successive government are unwilling to address the issues. I should remind my colleagues again that justice delayed is justice denied. It is time we get this court case moving, and let's get it to that weapon against injustice, as quoted by my colleague across the hall, the Caribbean Court of Justice. Further, Mr. Speaker, Article 149G of the same Constitution says, "Indigenous people shall have the right to the protection, preservation, and promulgation of their languages, cultural heritage, and way of life." Article 27 further states that all Guyanese shall have the right to free education, and that education must cater to the future needs of the nation and be culturally appropriate. I remind this Honorable House that where there is enshrined in the Constitution a right, there is a parallel responsibility on the government and among us, the representatives of the people, to ensure that those constitutional responsibilities are met. Today, again, administration after consecutive administration can find finances and time allocation in the curriculum for Portuguese and Spanish, while UNESCO has identified that many Indigenous peoples are at risk of losing their languages. Mr. Speaker, Minnie Degawan, an Indigenous leader and activist from the Philippines, said, "For Indigenous peoples, languages not only identify their origin or membership in a community, they also carry the ethical values of their ancestors, the Indigenous knowledge system that makes them one with the land, and are crucial to their survival and to the hopes and aspirations of their youth." UNESCO also stated, "The state of Indigenous languages today mirrors the situation of Indigenous peoples. In many parts of the world, they are on the verge of disappearance. The biggest factor contributing to their loss is state policy. Some governments refer to Indigenous languages as dialects and accorded them less importance than national languages, contributing to their eventual loss. Our communities are struggling through COVID-19. Schools on the coast are enjoying internet access, TV, and radio broadcast learning tools, while many of our Indigenous communities are expected to self-teach in a language that is somewhat alien to them in preparation for exams that are mostly void of their collective histories. COVID-19 has revealed the systemic failures and deficiencies within our education and governmental structures. Mr. Speaker, the state apparatus sees Indigenous peoples as developmental projects instead of partners. This is a sad, myopic, and obtuse view that needs to change towards one that allows Indigenous peoples the right of sustainable self-determination as outlined by Jeff Corntassel, an Indigenous scholar. Mr. Speaker, we have seen infrastructure projects such as roads, bridges, hospitals, internet, and electricity coming to communities on the coast to support education and the economy, while Indigenous communities are forced to deal with inadequate solar panels, sluggish and unreliable internet connection, and poorly maintained trails. This, Mr. Speaker, is an indictment of all previous administrations. Added to this, Mr. Speaker, not only are communities dealing with this in a COVID environment, they are trying to deal with this while at the same time trying to deal with land conflicts and climate change, which threatens both their personal and food security. Mr. Speaker, Indigenous peoples also want access to the global marketplace, and in accordance with Article 14(1) E and F of the 2006 Amendment Act, especially in relation to the development and regulation of agriculture. As such, I am calling for a subvention to be created by the Ministry of Agriculture that covers the cost of not only attaining organic certification as stipulated by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, but also for commercial farming in Indigenous communities. We welcome culturally appropriate agricultural development strategies and microeconomies within our Indigenous communities in line with EFPIC. Mr. Speaker, I ask that the government examine my request because it is of benefit to the health of all Guyanese. By its design, Mr. Speaker, the colonial system has kept Indigenous peoples in a state of perpetual poverty. I heard my colleague, the honorable member from Parima, complain about preferential treatment being given to coastlanders, while the communities are fully capable of doing the work. Mr. Speaker, this is indicative of a procurement act that not only permits the coast to profit and grow, while communities continue to be marginalized within basic policy formulations. If companies are sympathetic, they hire low-end laborers out of pity. We should not have to rely on sympathy. Guyana is not only in need of an Indigenous people's policies coupled with the revised Amendment Act. We are in need of a revised Procurement Act that guarantees Indigenous communities a system of equity, not sympathy. Sympathy, Mr. Speaker, without empathy is apathy disguised. Indigenous people should not have to hope and cope. Indigenous peoples need development partners, not a customer-client relationship of dependency through projects. In 2016, UNICEF released a study on the status of Indigenous women and children. It was an indictment on all previous administrations from independence to now. To date, I still await the integration of the findings of this study in any budgetary discourse or considerations. Mr. Speaker, as a representative of an independent oppositional seat, my duty is to find the elusive middle ground. The people's work should always take precedence over egos, or as the great poet Martin Parker said, all are involved, all are consumed. Mr. Speaker, roughly $3 billion was spent on haze in 3 years, with roughly 20 success stories. That is almost $150 million per person. Then we switch to CSOs, paying CSOs, while village councils continue to fail. Tushaos continue to bear significant responsibilities but get paid a meager and paltry $30,000 per month, regardless of which administration goes into office. I support the Honourable Madam Tashira's remarks that this is not, and I say this is not, time for campaign. This is
Honourable Deputy, she may have to support you with an extension.
Comrade Speaker, I do move that the Honourable Member be given 5 minutes to conclude this presentation.
Thank you very much. Honourable Member, Honourable Deputy, you may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Chief Whip of the Opposition. I support the Honourable Madam Tashira's remarks that this is not a campaign. This is the time to get the people's work done. I heard the Minister of Labour, the Honourable Mr. Hamilton, mention that we cannot be judged by our words, but by our actions. I beg to differ with the Honourable Minister. We are judged by our words and our actions. The 5 long months' fight for the preservation of democracy has strengthened my resolve that we can do better. We must all do better. Mr. Speaker, the previous Minister of Indigenous Peoples Affairs often quoted an African proverb that said, "While the elephants fight, the grass suffers." While not articulated in this budget, I look forward to working with all my colleagues in this honourable House to driving for the people all the tools to enhance our democracy and people's lives, from electoral reform, legislative reform, a UN-regulated platform for truth and reconciliation, inclusive microeconomies, a comprehensive local content policy, and last but not least, the failing of every governing administration, constitutional reform. Mr. Speaker, that in September 2020 we are presenting a budget for a year that has almost ended demonstrates how far we have deteriorated as a nation. We cannot, we must not permit politics to deny our people of their right to live in a society where they can prosper. Honourable colleagues, we all say ad nauseum that we abide by the Constitution. But the Constitution also says in Article 40, every person in Guyana is entitled to the basic rights to a happy, creative, and productive life, free from hunger, ignorance, and want. That right includes the fundamental rights and freedoms of the individual. Such meaningful and powerful words, Mr. Speaker. Yet we have differently abled people whose constitutional rights get trampled on every single day, even though the Constitution under Article 149(2) says they have a right to not be discriminated against. These constitutional rights should not be confined only to the coast. It is in the Constitution of Guyana. And last I checked, Indigenous peoples are the first peoples of Guyana and are also protected by and provided for in this very Constitution. Mr. Speaker, I ask my colleagues that while we go about our respective ways of doing the people's work, let us do so in a circumspect and considerate manner that brings economic, social, legal, ethical, environmental, and moral justice and equity to all our peoples. Mr. Speaker, let me close by thanking our international partners, the global community, and the Guyanese diaspora, who showed their commitment to Guyana through our fight for democracy. I look forward to the prosperous and sustainable future in store for Guyana, and I urge all my colleagues to work for Guyana and all the people who placed us here. The days of party paramountcy should be very firmly and squarely behind this. Mr. Speaker, I thank you.